Good morning, students. Today we are going to discuss very important topic again of respiration, that is regulation of respiration. And this regulation of respiration can be of two types. Chemically, we can control the respiration as well as we can control it through the nervous system. So in today's session, what I am going to discuss is nervous regulation of respiration. Under these objectives, I am going to discuss is, first we are going to see the respiratory centers, the organization, the peripheral inputs, how they are going to affect the respiration, and in short, the applied aspect. As all of you know, that the normal rate of respiration in adults is around 12 to 18 per minute, and in this rate, approximately 500 ml of tidal volume is taken inside. But this is adjusted as per the requirements of the body. So whatever body metabolism it is, the requirement will be decided and the rate as well as the volume of air will be discussed. Now this will be having an automatic control over the respiratory system, the rate as well as the depth of respiration. So it is having an automatic control which is an involuntary function, and this automatic control is through the medullary and quantile centers. We also have the spontaneous respiration generation, which gives a rhythmic discharge of motor neurons, which will innervate the respiratory muscles, and we have the spontaneous respiration. Now, what is the functional significance of this spontaneous respiration and automatic control? The functional significance is that you have to breathe without conscious effort due to these control system. So you don't have to remember that you have to breathe every minute, every second. And during sleep also, it is continuously going on. And why it is possible? Because there is an automatic control on the respiration. So what are these control mechanisms and why we want this? These are some pictures. If you see, can see our dear Prime Minister, who is a public figure. He always gives so many speeches. Actually, this is a rare incidence now. It is a public gathering, and now we don't have the chance of seeing all these public gatherings, but he is very active on the web platform also. The second picture is the famous singer Shankar Mahadevan, and he is famous for his breathless singing. Now this is, I don't remember the name of this sports person, but he is a world swimming champion. Those who are interested can find out the name. So breathing is, you have to control during swimming also. And these are some day-to-day activities. Animals as well as the human beings are involved in these particular activities. I have given some examples, but all of these can be requiring the voluntary control, and this voluntary control, the centers are in the cerebral cortex. So everyone may not be singer, may not be swimmer, but everyone daily speaks, everyone daily laughs. So these are some of the things where you require a voluntary control over your respiration. Say for example, I am giving this particular session, so I have to adjust my breathing pattern accordingly. Many a times you must have seen that madam तुमचा आवाज जरा कमी येतोय, ma'am आपकी आवाज कम आ रही थी वीडियो में. So many persons, they always text me. Why? Because I don't have the control over the respiration. So this control, I have to think first, plan first, and then the cerebral cortex will give that control over the respiration, and then I can give a fluent speech. So these day-to-day activities like talking, singing, swimming, laughing, say for example, breath holding underwater, or if you want to have hyperventilation, these are possible due to the voluntary control. So major part is involuntary, and that is the centers are situated in the middle part of the brain, that is medulla and the pons. But the higher centers situated in the cerebral cortex, they have an voluntary control over the respiration for these particular things. Now coming to the functions of respiratory centers. The major function of these respiratory centers is that they will generate the normal respiratory spontaneous rhythm. So the spontaneous generation of respiration is going to occur, and they will have a control over the rate of respiration and depth of respiration. So this is the function of these respiratory centers. So if you are looking at this particular figure, this is the middle part of the brain which is having a medulla and the pons. Now you have the pontine respiratory group and you have the medullary respiratory group, which is of two types, dorsal and ventral. So this pons and the medulla oblongata, through the spinal cord, they are giving out some nerves. So phrenic nerve is emerging, and this phrenic nerve is going to supply the diaphragm. So this diaphragm, as you all know, that is muscle, major muscle involved in the process of inspiration. So whenever these centers are activated via the phrenic nerve, the activity of the diaphragm can be controlled. So you can control the rate and depth of respiration. As well as these are the centers which are important for the spontaneous rhythm generation. So you have that particular spontaneous rhythm of respiration since birth. Now these intercostal muscles are also involved in process of respiration, and they are supplied by the intercostal nerves. So these intercostal nerves are again influenced by the activity of these centers which are situated in the medulla and the pons. So through these nerves, the centers are going to control the activity of these muscles of respiration, and then we can control the rate as well as the depth of respiration. So what are these respiratory centers? Actually, these are composed of several groups of neurons, and they are present bilaterally in the medulla and the pons, which is also known as brainstem. The dorsal respiratory group is mainly for inspiration, whereas the ventral respiratory group is for inspiration as well as expiration. The pneumotaxic center, which is again a center which controls the rate and depth of breathing. So it causes the transition of inspiration to expiration. Then we have a fourth center, apneustic center, which is responsible for prolonged inspiration. So if you have to enumerate the respiratory centers, you can enumerate these four centers, and roughly, or these are the functions which are allotted to these groups of neurons. So this is the figure from the Guyton. You can see here you have the dorsal respiratory group of neuron. This is ventral group of neuron, and then you have the pneumotaxic center, and you have the apneustic center. So this ventral respiratory neuron group of neuron is responsible for expiration as well as inspiration, whereas the dorsal respiratory group of neuron is going to influence only the inspiration. Now this apneustic center, in some of the books, the itself apneustic center, whether it is present or not is questionable. You can go through the Canon book, and some of the major things now as has been researched by research, but again it is a questionable thing that whether this center is present or not. You have the pneumotaxic center, and the function of this pneumotaxic center is that it inhibits the acoustic center, and then it activates all these centers, the dorsal as well as the ventral respiratory group of neurons. Coming to the dorsal respiratory group, this is playing the fundamental role in the control of respiration. It is located in the dorsal portion, as we have already seen. Most of its neurons are located in the nucleus of tractus solitarius. So the neurons are majorly present in this nucleus of tractus solitarius. You must have seen all these factors in your anatomy classes. Now in NTS, that is nucleus of tractus solitarius, is the sensory termination of both the vagal as well as the glossopharyngeal nerves that transmit the sensory signals into the respiratory system. So these two nerves are carrying the sensory signals, and this is the structure where it is termination of these sensory signals is occurring. So whatever information, the metabolic requirement will be through these vagus and the glossopharyngeal nerve, and accordingly the activity of these centers will be changed, and it will give the information to the respiratory motor pathways, and the rate as well as depth of respiration will be controlled. So the first important factor which is through this medullary respiratory center is that it generates the basic rhythm of respiration. But still, the cause for this basic rhythm is unknown. Those who are interested in finding out this, you can find out and give the answers to all. In primitive animals, it has been seen that a neural network is there, and one set of neurons, which is self-excitatory, excites the second set of neurons. This second set of neurons inhibits the first one. And after a period, the mechanism repeats itself and continues throughout the life. So this was studied in animals, the neural network, which is self-excitatory, and the excitation and inhibition cycle goes on continuously throughout the life. And this is expected that the similar mechanism is to be present in humans. So this was majorly present or researched in primitive animals. In human being, still it is expected that a similar mechanism may be working. Now in cases of inspiration, there is a signal, and this particular signal is termed as ramp signal. So the nervous signal which is transmitted to the inspiratory muscles is not instantaneous. Like say, for example, there is no burst of action potential. It will be very slowly goes on increasing in a ramp fashion. So it begins weakly, increases steadily in a ramp manner, normally the 2 seconds of normal respiration. Then contraction of inspiratory muscle will occur and inspiration will commence. It then stops for approximately next 3 seconds, and that turns off the excitation of inspiratory muscle. So the elastic recoil of lungs and chest wall will cause the expiration. The inspiratory signals begin again another cycle, and this will continue again and again. So this is a cycle, the potential which is causing the inspiration and expiration. But here it is not a burst of action potential. It is like a ramp. So this is like a ramp. Very slowly it goes on increasing. So 2 seconds it will be contraction, inspiratory muscle. So inspiration will occur. Then it will be sudden inhibition of inspiratory muscle. So for next 3 seconds, there will be expiration. And due to that, due to this particular fashion of RAM, it allows the slow feeling of lungs. So there will be no inspiratory gasp. Otherwise, if it is a burst-like structure, then you have to, respiration will be in gasp. It is not slow, steadily possible. So this is the importance of this ramp signal. So generally the respiratory cycle will follow like this. First the DRG will cause the inspiratory ramp signal. It gives sensory information mainly to the diaphragm. So contraction of the inspiratory muscle, inspiration occurs. Then there will be switch off of the ramp signal, and that causes the elastic recoil of lungs and chest wall, and then the expiration will take place. And this is a respiratory cycle which starts after birth and continues till death. Coming to the ventral respiratory group, it is located on each side of medulla, and it is around 5 millimeter anterior and lateral to the dorsal group. It consists of 4 main nuclei. The first one is Watzinger complex, which is controlling the expiration. Then there is a pre-Watzinger complex, which sets the pace of respiration. Third one is nucleus ambiguous, which is responsible or having the inspiratory neurons. And the fourth one is nucleus retroambiguous, which is having both the inspiratory as well as the expiratory neuron. So this will be the structure again. It is the same figure from Guyton and Gannon. And in the examination, you always have this in a common question where you have to enumerate and give the functions of each of the respiratory group of neurons. So again, you have to draw the figure and give this anatomical structure also along with the function. Now, what is the function of this ventral respiratory group? Generally, it remains inactive during the normal quiet inspiration. It consists both. We have seen that inspiratory neurons are present, expiratory neurons are present. But Normally in quiet respiration, they become silent, inactive. They become only active during the forceful respiration process. Say for example, during exercise. So there is an electric stimuli of few neurons in the VRG. If it is done, there will be inspiration. If there is few neurons in the VRG, it can cause expiration. And it has been proved that it can contribute to both inspiration and expiration, but remains inactive during normal quiet respiration. Only during forceful respiration it becomes active. Now coming to the third respiratory group, that is Quantile respiratory center. We have the acoustic center, and this function is inhibitory neurons are present bilaterally in the pons, and they will be having the integrator neurons, and IOS is inspiratory of switch neurons. So what they are going to do, they will be switch off inspiration. So they will be causing inhibition of inspiration. So that prevents the switch off of RAM because it is having inhibition over the iOS. So it causes the integration and it prevents the switch off of RAM. And if there is no switch off of the inspiration will continue. There will be no expiration. Earlier, generally after 2 seconds, you will be activating the switch off neurons. But here, if this center is activated, it will not, it will prevent the switch off of the RAM, and that increases the depth and duration. So inspiration will go on and on. And if you have increased depth and duration, it is termed as apneusis. Normally, it is kept inhibited by vagus and pneumotaxic centers. Generally, this center completely is under inhibition of vagus and pneumotaxic center. So this apneustic center in the figure we have seen. So this is a pneumotaxic center and this is the vagus center. And both of these activity will normally have the inhibition of this apneustic center. But if the inhibition is not there, then this apneustic center will be stimulated, and if it is stimulated, what it causes, it increases the depth and duration, causes the apneusis. How it is causing? It is like, say for example, this is a ramp signal, and why it is stopping? Because the switch of neurons are activated, but these will be inhibited by this acoustic center. So this ramp will go on and on. And due to that, the depth and duration of respiration will be increased. Now coming to the fourth center, that is pneumotaxic center. This is located in the upper pons, particularly in the parabrachial nucleus. It transmits the signal to the inspiratory area. It controls the switch off point of inspiratory ramp. So there is a transition of inspiration to expiration. So that is controlled by this pneumotaxic center. And thus it controls or plays an important role in the feeling phase of lung cycle. If there are very strong signals from this center, that decreases the duration of inspiration. It can be seen up to 0.5 seconds. So there is very short time for feeling of lungs. And if there are weak signals, that increases the duration of inspiration. So there is more time for feeling of lungs. So generally it controls the transition of inspiration to expiration, and due to that it controls mainly the feeling phase of lung cycle. So depending on the metabolic needs of the body, there will be strong signals or there will be weak signals. Now if there are strong signals, the duration of inspiration will be decreased because switch off will be activated earlier, and there will be less time for feeling of lungs, and due to that it also decreases the duration of expiration, and total frequency of respiration will be increased because it will be less duration, but the frequency will be more if the strong signals are seen from the pneumotaxic center. If the center signals are weak, the duration of inspiration will be increased. Opposite effect you are going to see. More time will be there for feeling of lungs, It also increases the duration of expiration, but the frequency of respiration will be decreased. So there will be less frequency, so rate will be decreased, but the volume will be increased. And here in cases of strong, the rate will be increased, but the feeling will be less. There is also a role of reticular activating system which controls our respiration. So what is this reticular activating system? It is a part in the brain which is actually important for the sleep purpose. So this reticular activating system, if it is inhibited, then only we are able to have the sleep. In your CNS physiology, this sleep again will be discussed, and the functions of reticular activating system also will be discussed. Now, whenever this activating system is stimulated, you have the increased respiratory drive. During sleep, the activity will be decreased and the respiratory drive will be decreasing, and that decreases the alveolar ventilation, raising the carbon dioxide partial pressure. So this is the reticular formation which keeps us alert. So the major function of this reticular activating system is it always keeps you alert. Now in cases whenever it is inhibited somewhat during sleep, which is a normal physiological process. So you can see this is radiations are there and it is having information from all, like from visual, auditory, motor projection, sensory projection, touch, pain, temperature. So from all sensations, it will receive the information. So it becomes, it allows you to be alert. And if that is inhibited, which happens during sleep, the activity decreases, the drive decreases, and decreases the alveolar ventilation, and that raises the partial pressure of carbon dioxide also. So there are so many problems in the during the sleep. You must have seen that sleep apnea is there. You have difficulty in sleep, like expiration cycle. They might be affected. Obese persons, they also have the difficulty. There are so many things which are physiologically affected. At the time of your CNS lectures, again these things will be repeated. So that is related to the regulation of respiration via the respiratory centers. We have discussed what are different respiratory centers, what are their functions and how they are changing the rate and rhythm of respiration. Now, apart from these centers, you have so many afferent impulses which are changing the rate and rhythm and acting over the respiratory centers. So these are from higher centers, from non-chemical receptors, from chemical receptors. So many chemical things also can change the respiration. Non-chemical receptors, if they are stimulated, they also will be causing change in respiration. And from higher centers also, they can change the respiration. So you can see by this figure, this is I have taken from net, I think, I don't remember the name of the book, but I think from the net I have taken this particular figure, but this gives an idea that these are the inputs on the respiratory centers. So they are situated in the medulla oblongata. So we know that many of the things can change the activity of the respiratory centers. So we can have the higher centers of the brain. So suppose speaking, as I have given the example, emotions, like many of the times overdrive through the overdrive of emotions can have speechless. You must have heard that trauma, due to trauma, the person is not able to breathe. So that is the problem we can see due to emotions. It can change the activity of these centers. Voluntary controls we have, you know that many breathing techniques of yoga and all, that you can have a control over the breathing. Then these chemoreceptors through the carotid body and aortic body can change the pH, the carbon dioxide concentration, the oxygen concentration, and through these receptors, these activity again through the chemical changes we can have. In the next class, we are going to discuss the chemical regulation of respiration. Now this hearing grower reflects also that whenever you are stretching, you have the stretch receptors in the lungs, and if you have enough air in the lungs, it will give the information that that is much, now you stop the respiration. So that information always changes. Then proprioceptors in the muscles and joints. So these are the receptors which are present in the muscle and joints. They will also have an influence over these respiratory centers. Receptors for touch, temperature, and pain stimuli. They also are having an influence on these respiratory centers. So we have already actually discussed from higher centers. The neocortex is the voluntary control where the respiration is voluntarily controlled. So part of the cortex which is newly a new thing, a newly evolutionized part of cortex. So that is termed as neocortex, and this is where the voluntary control of respiration is going on. So what happens? It bypasses these centers, the medullary respiratory centers, and directly it goes to the spinal respiratory neurons. So through the cortex, it directly receives the spinal respiratory neurons, and then it can control the activity of respiration. We have already seen that it has talking, singing, swinging, breath holding, all these activities. You also have the control through the limbic system. So limbic system is related to all of our emotions. So during emotions, you must have seen, you must have heard that you have different patterns of breathing. During pain also. So this limbic system is through the pontomedullary respiratory neurons can control the respiration. So these are the things which you have to remember that that might change the rate and depth of respiration. If these non-chemical receptors are there, the first one is pulmonary stretch receptor, which is hearing grower reflex. You can read it separately. Again, a short answer question is very commonly asked in the Viva also. It is very commonly asked question. As a homework, you can study this hearing grower reflex. I think roll number 179. That he or she will complete the hearing grower reflex for this. From J receptors, from irritant receptors, from proprioceptors, from chest wall stretch receptors, from baroreceptors, from thermoreceptors. So see, we have so many receptors from coming all over the body, and all these can change non-chemically the respiration rate and depth. So this is hearing grower reflex. So what happens is that whenever there is inspiration, suppose the tidal volume normally it is around 500 ml, but if it is increased more than 1 liter, then there is a stretch of the airways and these receptors will be stimulated. They will increase the respiratory rate and that decreases the time also. And there is a negative or that decreases the time for inspiration and that decreases or inhibits the inspiration. So this is continued as a negative feedback servo control mechanism. So it depends on the tidal volume. So if it is more than 1 liter, then the stretch will be activated, the receptors. And this is termed as hearing grower reflex. You also have inflation reflex, you have deflation reflex. So lung inflation stimulates the stretch receptors which are present in the bronchi and bronchioles. The vagus nerves that will affect the pontomedullary centers and they will inhibit the inspiration. But remember that the stretch receptors will be activated only when the tidal volume is more than 1 to 1.5 liters. Now, what are J receptors? These J receptors were found out by Indian physiologist A.S. Quantile in 1954. So, we have a discovery on our own name and they are present as in the juxtapulmonary capillary receptors. So, these are unmyelinated vagal afferents. They are sensitive to increase in the content of interstitial fluid between the capillary endothelium and alveolar epithelium. So we have seen the respiratory membrane and in between the membrane you have the interstitial fluid. Whenever there is an increase in this content of interstitial fluid, these fibers will be activated. And this stimulation causes apnea or it can cause hyperventilation, bradycardia, hypotension and weakness of skeletal muscles. So this is again through the J receptors. Very common, everyone must have seen irritant receptors, cough reflex, you have sneezing reflex, you have Herring-Brewer deflation reflex, and you can have reflex tachypnea or bronchoconstriction. So whenever there is irritant receptor stimuli, you can have any of these activity. In cases of deglutition, whenever you are eating something, then at that particular time, again the respiration will be affected. Now you again correlate with all these activities. Then from proprioceptors, these are inspiratory neurons. They will stimulate the inspiratory neurons and they will increase the rate and depth of respiration. Now, why you want to increase this? Because you want the increase in the ventilation. And this is generally seen during the exercise. What are these proprioceptors? These are the receptors which are present in the muscles and joints. So during exercise, they will be stimulated and they will cause the increased rate and depth of respiration. You must have seen this touch receptor also. So the picture, if it is clear, this is a scene from 3 Idiots. And I could not download the video, but you might be remembering this particular video where Kareena Kapoor is telling Amir Khan to, because the baby born is not breathing. So they all are panic. And what they do is she asks, ki pat karo, usko maro. Maro is what we are going to do is we are stimulating the touch receptors. So this is a very common scene which we see at the time of birth. So many children just after birth, if they are not spontaneous breathing, then what we have to do is tap. So give the stimulus, give the pinch, and then you can tap over the back also, you can tap over the foot also, or you can pinch. And these pinching, that will stimulate the inspiratory neuron. So touch will be causing the inspiratory neuron stimulation. You have the chest wall receptors also, where the muscle spindle of intercostal muscles, they are stimulated and they will coordinate the breathing during change in posture and during speech. So while walking also, if you are changing the postures also, you will be able to speak and have a control over the respiration. So it is intercostal to intercostal reflex, and this is also an intercostal to phrenic reflex. So from the intercostal nerves it goes to intercostal reflex, intercostal nerve causing the reflex, or from the through the intercostal nerve it goes to phrenic also, phrenic nerve also, and that causes a reflex breathing pattern. So accordingly, whatever change of posture is there or whatever change during speech is there, it is through these reflexes. It is possible. So this is how it is acting. See, these are the chest wall, these are the intercostal muscles, and this is the particular structure. So if you want to change these, you have the intercostal reflex. So you change the activity of the intercostal muscles. You always can change the diaphragm activity through the phrenic reflex. And that is possible due to change in the posture. So if you are changing, like suppose you are standing, if you are sleeping, that changes the breathing pattern also. Then you have the baroreceptors. Raised blood pressure stimulates the baroreceptors in the carotid sinus and aortic arch. That causes inhibition of respiration. Already you must have studied in your cardiovascular system. So whenever there is increase in the blood pressure, there is inhibition of respiration. So clinically also this condition you always have to remember. Then you have thermoreceptors, which are of two types, warm and cold. Warm receptors, they act via the somatic afferent nerves and then cerebral cortex causing hyperventilation. And that is seen in heat loss mechanisms. Say for example, panting in dogs can be seen. Now these completes all afferent impulses also. Coming to the third part of this session is the applied aspect. So I am going to discuss in short what will be the changes. If there is a complete transection of brainstem, then it stops all respiration, so leads to apnea. But if vagi are intact or cut, there will be no change. Okay. If there is transection which is above bounds. So if there are so many accidental injuries, so many head injuries, you have seen, you might see in your next like third year classes or internship or doing post graduation, these patients are very common. There may be transection, but if it is above pons, then there will be decerebration. Regular breathing will be continued. But the respiratory, because the respiratory centers are located both in the medulla and the pons, and there will be no change if vagi are intact or cut. So depending on the level of the injury, you can say. So many times you must have heard that हाँ उसको लगा था, head injury हुआ था, but the respiration is intact. Maybe there is damage to other structures. Transection at the mid-pons. Then what happens is pneumotaxic center will be cut off from the apneustic center because the pons is cut. So there is no check over the apneustic center, and then apneustic center becomes overactive. If vagi are cut, there will be prolonged and sustained inspiration. But if vagi are intact, they inhibit the apneustic center, and respiration will be regular and rhythmic but slow and deep. If there is transection at junction of pons and medulla, then the respiration continues, it is rhythmic, but it becomes irregular. But if the vagi are intact or cut, no change is there. So that vagus nerves, they play a very important role. Brain edema. Then if there is head hit or to the solid object, this condition may occur. So damaged brain tissues will swell, and there will be compression of cerebral arteries, which causes blockage of cerebral artery supply, and this leads to depression or inactivation of the respiratory centers. And very commonly we do, as a doctor, anesthesia we give, and then if there is overdosage of anesthesia or narcotics, that leads to respiratory center depression. It can cause respiratory arrest, and generally it is seen that the center is depressed more by the use of a drug which is sodium phenobarbital. So that is again a very important topic you have to remember. Those who are interested in doing their post-graduation in anesthesia can read out more. So to summarize, it's a lengthy topic, but it is a very important topic, as again I am telling you that neural regulation will be of automatic control. It can be controlled by different afferent impulses, can be controlled via the higher centers through non-chemical receptors and from chemical receptors. So thank you very much, and read the topic and try to understand the concept after watching the